I have been talking over the last week, as I mentioned, because he has serious concerns about the policies of the current Canadian government in relationship to the Canadian Charter of Rights, which was established as part of the Constitution Act in the 1980s. And he, as I said in the bio, is the only living minister who participated in that constitutional process and is therefore a unique, let's say, historical and current resource, because he can help illuminate Canadians as to the intent of the people who were instrumental in drafting, writing, and agreeing on all of those fundamentally important accords. So let's start by talking about what concerns are driving you to re-enter the political discussion at the moment.
Well, primarily it is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, especially those freedoms and rights that are in sections 2, 6, 7, and 15 of the Charter, which I helped craft. And they're freedoms of association, freedoms of expression, religion, conscience, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, that's in section 2. Section 6, freedom of mobility, the right to travel anywhere in Canada or leave Canada. Section 6 deals with life, liberty, and the security of the person. And Section 15 with equality. Every Canadian is equal before the law. As we sit here today, those provisions are being violated by all the governments of Canada, but in particular, in my case right now, the federal government of Canada. And I'm about to launch a lawsuit against the federal government because of these mandates, especially their travel ban.
Concerns are driving you to re-enter the political discussion at the moment?
Well, primarily it is the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, especially those freedoms and rights that are in sections 2, 6, 7, and 15 of the Charter, which I helped craft. And they're freedoms of association, freedoms of expression, religion, conscience, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, that's in section 2. Section 6, freedom of mobility, the right to travel anywhere in Canada or leave Canada. Section 6 deals with life, liberty, and the security of the person. And Section 15 with equality. Every Canadian is equal before the law. As we sit here today, those provisions are being violated by all the governments of Canada, but in particular, in my case right now, the federal government of Canada. And I'm about to launch a lawsuit against the federal government because of these mandates, especially their travel ban. There's no other travel ban in the Western world like this one, and yet we're the second largest country in the world by geography. This impinges upon my right of travel, my right to travel to my family back east or my friends. It takes away my right as a Canadian to be protected by the mobility right of Section 6.
Okay,
and therefore, I feel that the federal government has overreached its authority.
Okay, so let me get this clear, because I'm still having a hard time conceptualizing the fact that this is actually a reality. So the situation we have in Canada is that a former drafter of what is one of the most fundamental articles of our shared agreement as a people is now about to launch a legal claim against the government itself for violating the fundamental principles upon which the entire country is founded and assembled and agrees. That's not too blunt?
No, that is very, very accurate. That's exactly what's happening. I'm the only First Minister left alive who was at that conference and helped draft these freedoms and these rights and the Constitution Act of 1982 itself. And I do this very reluctantly. I've been watching this thing now for almost 2 years. I've been speaking out about it at public meetings and on my blog and so on. And I've come to the conclusion now that I must, as a Canadian, and as one of the writers and founders of the Constitution Act of 1982, not only speak about it, I must act about it. I must show Canadians that I'm so concerned as a citizen and as a former First Minister that helped craft this Constitution Act 1982, that I must take action against my own government because they have violated rights that I and others helped craft in 1981, 1982. This is my deliberate consideration and that of my lawyers of what is going on in this country. What is happening is that there is a section in Charter of Rights and Freedoms which allows governments to override these freedoms in unusual circumstances. And I remember this very well when we were crafting the Constitution. These unusual circumstances, because we're putting it in the Constitution, it's not a federal act or a provincial act. It's in a Constitution which is supposed to enshrine permanent values and give glue to the country. Okay, so this section 1 can only be used, and I remember this well, in times of peril, in times of war and insurrection, or when the state is in peril, when the existence of the state is in peril. This particular virus, for which there's a recovery of 99%, a fatality rate of less than 1%, does not constitute, in my view, a situation where the country is in peril. And therefore, I argue that Section 1 doesn't even apply, even though they're trying to make it apply and use that as the reason for doing what they're doing. They have not even acknowledged that they received them. And
so how do you account for that? What's going on?
Well, it seems to me that the media very early on bought into the government narrative and developed the same kind of fear that a lot of individuals did because of what they was being told. All was being proposed with all these cases, even though these cases didn't represent hospitalizations or ICU visits or whatever. And so there was a fear generated early on, and the mainstream media bought into it very quickly, and now are out trying to sustain the narrative that they became a part of early on. Is the only way I can explain it. Of course, we also know that all the mainstream media have received significant sums of money from the government of Canada over the last 3 years, over $600 million. So one cannot but mention that in any discussion like this, that one has to ask the question, has this flow of money from the federal government to the Canadian press in any way impinged upon their impartiality to tell the story on both sides of the issue? Rights and freedoms. If us as First Ministers, Dr. Peterson, had wanted to just have protecting rights and freedoms that could easily be changed, we wouldn't have gone to the Constitution. We would have just said, put an act in the federal parliament and put acts in all the parliaments, and then up to the whim of the political party at the time could change it. We wanted to safeguard it so that it was beyond the whim of political machinations, and therefore could not be changed only in the most extreme circumstances. So what we're really concerned about, and what I'm really concerned about, is if our charter is not upheld and then honored, and these freedoms and rights honored, then and therefore we lose, the next time around when there's an emergency 2 or 3 years from now, or the government decides and declares that there is an emergency, they can use this as a precedent, and the charter becomes further diluted, and then our rights and freedoms as individuals has been destroyed, and that section of being a democracy is no more. Yeah. Well, here's where the most insidious part of this equation comes into play. What the governments have done have used, in very many cases, existing legislation under which they have the power to make regulation. So they've used existing emergencies, legislation, and inflated it enough or interpreted it in a manner that they could also use in this circumstance and therefore issue additional regulation. And then in other cases, they did not fully explain or have a parliamentary committee look at other amendments when they opened their parliament and closed it within 2 or 3 days or a week. In other words, sufficient debate wasn't allowed to understand the repercussions of what they were doing when they were giving more power to the minister and more power to the public health officer.
Right. So this really means in some sense that none of these policies were subject to opposition. Because we could delve into that a little bit. You might say, well, in an emergency such that provisions shouldn't be subject to opposition because that's inefficient. But that is the same thing as saying two things. One is that they shouldn't be thought about because discussion between opposing parties is actually thought. And then the second thing it's saying is they should be implemented without recourse to the broader public, because the broader public is represented in that oppositional structure so that everybody's voices are being allowed to be heard. That's in some sense the whole point of the parliament, where parliament means place of talking fundamentally, and means more deeply than that, place of thinking, and even more deeply than that, place of discussion of the entire panoply of public opinion. That's all gone by the wayside in the name of efficiency, let's say, or something like that.
Yes, Doctor, and even it gets worse than that, because we have had time. One can perhaps relieve or excuse, if one wants to make so that your argument is completely reasonable, and say, for the first 90 days, when this thing began, you could make an argument that, okay, the governments had to move. But in any rational way, if they had used the emergency measures planning that was already in place, they would have moved to protect the vulnerable first, and then did a study on the rest. What else do we need to do in society? What they did is just a carte blanche over all of society without giving second thought to it. And now all of the studies, 90 days after this started, and 100 days, 120 days, show, right? And then the Great Barrington Declaration is a good example. Over a year old now is the Great Barrington Declaration. So they had lots of information. And Dr. Allen's report from Simon Fraser over a year ago. So they've had lots of information and scientific studies about what's going on to demonstrate that not only are the vaccines destructive, more destructive than any vaccines in our history, and that's a scientific fact, then they had time to adjust. And this is where they have not even been nimble in this kind of circumstance, when you think this is the very time that governments will be nimble. Okay, we'll see what we can do with the vulnerable, all these long-term care homes and the hospitals and those who are most vulnerable. And we'll now have the parliamentary committee on an expedited basis. I understand that. On an emergency basis, bring in experts from both sides within the next 30 days to see what else we should do in a reasonable and graduated way, or are what we're doing now the most appropriate way to respond to it.
Right. Culminated in recent months with the Quebec lockdown, the curfew. I don't see how anybody can possibly make the case that that curfew was implemented under conditions that were as uncertain and dire as those that obtained in the initial phases of the pandemic, especially given that Omicron is obviously much less serious than the original virus. And also, we've already attained something approximating an 80% vaccination rate, and that's not going to be pushed up much higher than 90% without government intervention that becomes unbelievably heavy-handed. So there's less and less justification for more and more circumvention of parliamentary processes as this proceeds, instead of exactly the opposite.
Exactly. And that's why it took me this long to be convinced that I had to take this action. I mean, I never took this action 90 days after they brought in these things, or 100 days, or a year after, right? I've been watching this and commenting and articulating my concerns as Rex has. By the way, Rex and Murphy and I went to university together. We're both Newfoundlanders. We're all both born in Newfoundland. And I've heard him on your program with you and enjoyed the conversation and love the English literature and the classics like he does. And the vaccines that are being used are no longer applicable. They don't do anything to the existing variant that we have. They were devised for another variant or for the original virus. And the other thing is, people getting aboard planes, and my travel ban that I'm arguing on before the lawsuit is that everybody transmits it now, unvaccinated and vaccinated. Receive and transmit the virus. So it's hard to make the argument that the travel ban should be in place if the transmission of the virus, for which all of this is centered, is no longer valid. That is that the vaccinated protect against the virus because they receive it and transmit it the same as the unvaccinated. And now we find in Denmark, Israel, just in the last few days, right, and Australia, their case rates have gone through the roof again, even though they're 90% vaccinated. And so the whole basis, right, the whole basis of this argument of these lockdowns and travel bans and so on, the basis has crumbled, right? The whole citadel on which this so-called rational approach to a virus has completely crumbled. A lot of people have gone that route is because they have been almost pushed in that route. And you see the government then using their polling, here they are out advertising, you've got to get vaccinated on the television, and they're actually even doing ads for children and trying to talk to children directly through a public ad. So they're feeding off themselves. They're creating enough fear so that they'll get the poll they want to get.
If you win, what does that mean for the political sovereignty of the federal and provincial governments?
I think what that means is that if we win, we have identified that we have some very substantial laws on the books that, when challenged and brought rationally towards our highest courts, will be honored. And that will give Canadians faith to reform either the existing political parties or go with new political parties that recognize in their platform, which they've signed off on with the people, that they respect the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and only in very dire circumstances, like a war or insurrection, can it be circumvented, right? That we must get back to a parliamentary type of democracy. The power must be returned to the parliament. Look, Jody Raybo, when she argued as a Minister of Justice and then later wanted to appear before a parliamentary committee, she was allowed to appear a couple of times, then they shut the committee down, even though she indicated in writing that she had more information that she wanted to present. So there was the complete, tyranny of the majority, and for the parliamentary system to work. We have examples all over the place of this in all of the parliaments of Canada. So if we win, I think it will restore some confidence in our system with Canadians, and tell them that, yes, we have to reform the system more, and we can go with other political parties or reform the existing ones so that these leaders understand and revise their platforms to get back to what is true parliamentary democracy in our country. That's the best that we can see come out of that. So what does it say about... What they should be doing is sticking with the elected. All of the elected people in their legislative assemblies, everybody in their legislative assembly, right up to the Premier, and in the federal government. Go write your MPs, write your MLAs, ask them and demand meetings with them to go through what are you doing about this? What is your argument in favor of these mandates when all this information is available? So Canadians must start to really activate their civic responsibilities in a huge way, and then involve themselves in legitimate organizations who are open and free, that are going to help you do this kind of protest.
So you're saying that we should trust the basic institutions, we should have faith in them because they've worked for us in the past, they've united our country, and are drawn from a tradition that has united countries for long before that, and that we should start using them properly and responsibly.
And also, like in my particular case, the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms, Rocco Galati in Toronto, who's got a constitutional foundation, and he's initiating actions against the federal government. There's another one called, I think, the Canadian Constitutional Foundation itself in Ontario. All of these organizations who are looking for support, financial support, they should be supported because they're vanguards. They are protecting.
We can put links to them. We can put links to them in the description of this video. So we'll have if you can get your team to give